So welcome to video 5 in our series. In the first video I talked a little bit about different seat errors, seat problems that are very common and why they are problematic for the horse and for your progress as a rider. Then in the second video I was talking a little bit about lunging lessons to develop the seat and why they're not always the best way to go about it. And in the third video I talked about seat corrections that you may have heard before that can actually make problems worse. And in the fourth video, we were talking about how to be your own trainer if you don't have access to a good trainer. Not everybody lives near, someone who can teach them well. So sometimes you have to be scrappy and find out how you can improve even without a good trainer standing in the arena with you. Yeah, and today we want to talk a little bit about specifically how to use visualizations and Feldenkrais awareness through movement lessons to improve your seat. And I had a conversation with Catherine McCrum on those two, and we can go right to the recording of the conversation. We'll see you afterwards.
Yeah, so we wanted to talk a little bit about what people can do to improve their riding during a lockdown, or if their horse is laid up, or they broke a leg, or maybe they can ride, but they don't have an instructor who can help them with their seat, right? So, Catherine, so what options do people have that they can do in the living room, basically?
I come from a background of being a professional skier. And I've got a little story to tell about that because I broke my leg skiing, and that was obviously the season for me, and it ended. But as part of my rehab, while my leg was broken, I visualized and imagined myself walking, and in great detail, all the movements and the sensations I would feel through my body. And when the surgeon took off my cast, I literally could walk without a limp. And I was surprised and he was absolutely amazed. But it really shows the power of what can happen when you do this sort of work. And it was very exciting. And now I do it, I do it for riding, and I do it for all my sports. And the more clearly I can really visualize and imagine a movement on a sensory level, the more I can take it straight into my sport, almost from the first moment. So there are none of those first 2 or 3 days where you're kind of trying to find your way and your balance. It feels like you can slot straight in.
That's fascinating. Did you always do visualizations for skiing, or did that start with the fracture?
That started with the fracture, yeah. I mean, with the Feldenkrais method, which is what I teach, there's a lot of work in the imagination where you do the movements on one side. We do lots of quite complex movement patterns, a lot of variety, and you do it actually on one side, and then you imagine it on the second side. And so I had that experience in my body and in my thinking already, but somehow I hadn't made the jump to take that into my sports, maybe because I did my sports first and then I trained in Feldenkrais. Yeah,
because I always did these mental, I was obsessive about writing, and always relived the good moments, or I obsessed about the bad moments and then tried to find the point of where did it start to go wrong, what could I do differently if it happens again. And of course, mistakes tend to happen again and again in the same place, right, in the same context. So then I could sometimes come up with a solution to the problem, and then either the problem didn't even come up for some reason because it was prepared, right, or I could take a different exit of the freeway, so to speak, right, and find a different outcome. So for me, that was always part of my writing, and I don't know in how far everybody else does it. I've heard that a lot of top athletes use it.
They do, yeah. And actually, if you look at for instance, like a high board diver, you will see them standing at the top, and you can see them marking through their dive in their imagination, or they're visualizing their dive before they do it. And what happens, in fact, is that the neuromuscular pathways, if you like, are what's the word I'm looking for? It's not enlivened, but
Activated or
activated? Yes, the neuromuscular pathways are activated for that particular action. And so you genuinely, your muscles are switched on and engaged and ready for that.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It is, and it's neuroscientifically proven, of course, now.
I was just going to say there were studies, right, done on with athletes. So that's really interesting that is proof that it really works. Right?
It really works. It really works. And actually, sometimes it works better than actually going through the movements in reality, because when you do it in your imagination, you tend not to employ all the unconscious habitual efforts that accompany when you do it on the real side. So sometimes you can get even a better effect by visualizing and imagining.
So interesting. Yeah, makes sense. And I guess you can only have good run-throughs an exercise, right? And not all the failed attempts that you have in real life.
Indeed, yes, indeed. And I think what gets interesting is the more you become aware of every part of your body and how each part of your body relates to another part of your body and movement, the more accurately you can visualize yourself doing skillful activities.
Yeah.
When you only feel your hands, when you visualize, your hands will be very prominent and the rest of you won't be in your visualization. So part of it, I think, for you, Thomas, was as you got better at riding, you were able to feel more parts of yourself, and then the visualization gets more complete.
Yeah, exactly. More detailed and
more detailed. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, you can then feel more. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, and then of course, you're a Feldenkrais teacher. So for those who don't know much about Feldenkrais, so what can Feldenkrais do for the rider to get a better seat? Or
I think one of the greatest sort of principles of Feldenkrais is that if you don't know what you're doing, you can't do what you want. And what we mean by that is if you're not aware of what you're doing that is limiting you, then you continue to do what have always unconsciously done, that's been a stopper. And everything that you do on top of that feels like an effort to counteract what you don't know you're doing. So Feldenkrais is very good at bringing your habitual patterns of muscular contraction into the light of day. And the beauty of it is we also have hundreds of different lessons or movement lessons which show you new and more effective options for moving. So in terms of working with athletes, I haven't found anything more effective. And I have come from a training of being a personal trainer, a fitness instructor, Pilates, and, been involved in sports my entire life.
And so for riders, the pelvis and the hip joints play a really central role, but a lot of people have very little awareness of that.
Absolutely.
And Feldenkrais, I think, helps people feel every part of the body, right?
It does, yes, because we're working with this sensory feedback loop. Do a movement. Can you feel that in your hip joint? Can you feel the movement of the head of the femur in the hip socket? Once you can feel it, can you refine the movement so that everything smooths out and becomes more fluid? If you can take that onto your horse, then of course the aids that you give will be more refined. You'll be able to zero in on exactly how to move your hip joints, just the right amount, in order to invite your horse into a movement, rather than pushing and shoving them around and kind of getting there in the end.
Yeah, traditional riding lessons, of course, very often focus a lot on hands and legs.
Yes.
And not really on what you do with the rest of your body, right?
Yes.
So then it leads to a very sort of external pressure, driven kind of riding, holding, driving, gripping, and so on.
Yes.
Which doesn't really lead to a good outcome, for the horse and the rider. And when I was just talking about pelvis and hips, it made me think that I've taught a lot of people who had trouble steering with a horse, and then you would often see how they turn their head 90 degrees to the side, and then the shoulder maybe 45 degrees, but the pelvis keeps going straight, so the horse keeps going straight.
Yes.
And they pull the horse's head to the side, but the horse still goes straight.
Yes, and actually, I guess it imbalances them further, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's this disconnect between the torso and the lower half of the body in the riders, right? And the horse will not start turning until you can function as a whole, you know, until you can move your body as a whole. And I guess that, you know, Feldenkrais does that, you know.
It does. And, you know, you learn how to do exactly that deliberately, a counter twist, and then also how to turn everything as one piece, so that you develop a lot of refinement, I guess, or a big repertoire of possibilities in how you move. And I think what you said about the legs and the hands is so interesting, because, of course, if you only focus on your legs, what you're not doing is feeling how every movement of your leg has an impact through the whole of you. Right. So if I nudge my horse over with my lower leg, something changes in my pelvis, something changes in my spine, my ribs, my shoulders, my neck, my head, even my eyes. Right. And unless I'm aware of that, I could be doing all sorts of weird things above. And thinking, why isn't my horse responding to my leg? Well, because I'm unbalancing him from above and I don't even know, because I only ever pay attention to my lower leg and my hands.
Yeah. That's something that happens in lateral movements a lot.
Yeah.
Push with the leg and use more and more strength, because the horse won't budge, or the horse will go in the opposite direction against the leg. And yeah, there's a conflict between the weight aids, you know, and the leg aids. Like the weight tells them go one way and the leg tells them go in the opposite direction, right? Yeah, and then the more you use muscular strength, the more you lock up, right? And then you get stiff, and the torso may lean in the opposite direction, and so on.
Yeah, and certainly because I came to skiing before riding. I rode when I was a kid, but I came back to riding. The level of refinement that you need, the sensitivity and the amount of feel that you need in order for your horse to respond optimally is quite extraordinary. So it's really worth investing in a process where you develop this capacity for clear sensory perception.
Yeah, the riding happens with very, very small changes, small movements, right, in all the joints of the body, whereas most sports have big movements, you know, big arm movements, big leg movements, and so on. And so the margin for error is smaller, of course, when you have very tiny movements. You know, it's just millimeters instead of many centimeters. So
exactly. And then you've got the horse and the riders, you've got two nervous systems coming together, who might have quite different ideas about what they want to do. So that's always another interesting added challenge, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, it's very similar in a way to the skiing analogy, because snow conditions and terrain can change so quickly that you have to be incredibly reactive, adaptable, and spontaneous. If you're compulsively trying to control and put yourself in a position, you're never going to be able to get beyond skiing well on a blue run, you know, the sort of more beginnery kind of runs. Yeah,
interesting. So your posture changes depending on snow conditions and things.
Yes, absolutely. And you need to develop this, what we call a dynamic balance, this constantly unstable stability, which is a strange thing to say. But in skiing and in riding, I think it's similar in that we're always recovering our balance. We're always a little bit falling and recovering, a little bit falling and recovering. It's not that we find the place of balance and we stay there. Life's not like that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. In riding, it's very much like that. And traditionally, people often have a very static idea of the seat, like you're a statue and nothing moves, right? And you just pose and you hold that nice, pretty position, you know. But in reality, of course, everything's moving. The horse's back moves up and down and left and right and forward and back and so on. And you have to balance yourself over that, or with that motion of the horse's back.
Indeed. And I think that's where visualization and imagery can come into its own, in that if you can imagine the movements of the horse and then you can visualize not how you would keep that stiff, because once you imagine the movements of the horse, why on earth would you stay stiff?
Exactly.
But you can visualize how the movements of the horse would move you. You know, that can become a very interesting way of starting to I think understand how every single thing that your horse does disturbs your balance.
Right. And vice versa.
And vice versa. Yes.
Yeah.
And if you can visualize the two of you working together, and then also you might even visualize sometimes and you suddenly realize there's that point where you work against each other.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, happens a lot as you learn
Yeah.
to ride, that horse and rider work against each other or jog
Yes.
against each other, right?
Yes.
And, yeah, it's so interesting. And I was just thinking too about Feldenkrais, how you always talk about how one bone moves the next one, or you
Yes.
want to feel these chains of
Chains.
connections, right? And then when you're riding, you can continue those chains into the horse's body. Like I
Yes.
move this body in bone in my body, and that moves the next one. And then at some point, my body ends and the horse's body starts. And now
Yes.
my bones move the horse's bones. And then again,
Yes.
one horse bone to the next horse bone, all the way to the ground, or to the end of the
Absolutely.
horse,
Yeah.
the nose,
Yeah.
or whatever. So it's kind of interesting.
And I don't know if you've had this experience, Thomas, but when I visualize, for instance, if I now just visualize a leg yield, a simple leg yield, even in my visualization, I can already feel the little glitches going in one direction and the ease in the other direction. I can feel my horse's body and my body in the difficulty and
Right.
also in the ease.
Yeah,
And so anytime you're trying to visualize and you suddenly encounter something you can't imagine that moment, that tells you something that you're not clear about in your own movement.
Yeah, depending
It's very revealing.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, a lot of people have trouble turning their pelvis one way, so they cannot ride a leg yield in one direction, when in the other direction it's pretty good, right? Or they have trouble doing the flying change in one direction, and in the other direction it's always clean.
Yeah.
That thing, they're comfortable, going one way, and then they're stuck the other way.
Yes, and that simply comes down to, for many people, they're much more able to shift their weight onto one foot than the other.
Yeah, exactly.
It's quite simple, but unless you really know that you're doing that and you know how to do something different, then you're going to always have those sticky moments.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. But then you could also use visualization to visualize in slow motion doing the movement correctly the other way, right? So that would be also something that I would have done in the past.
Yeah.
To try and think, how am I doing this exactly, or what would need to happen, right? And then try to visualize and imagine what it would feel like and what that would look like.
Yes, what makes it so easy going to the left? Oh, I see. I really know how to pour my weight onto my left leg, which allows my right leg to swing through. But when I try to imagine going the other direction, I can't even start.
Exactly.
So yes, that's visualization, imagination, clarifying sensory perception, Feldenkrais, how that works together with riding. Is there anything else that we want to go on to today, or?
No, I think this is a good place to stop, because it's fascinating. We could end.
Yes, we could go on for ages. I know, and maybe we will.
Well, that was a really interesting conversation with Catherine. They're always really very fascinating, and hope you got some ideas of how you can work with visualizations and Feldenkrais lessons. And if you want to know more about it, then take a look at our next video. There we can tell you how we can help you specifically with visualizations and Feldenkrais lessons.